you from beautiful British Columbia. It's Earth, We Can Do This with host Paul W. Slusher.
Well, hello, Canada and the world. Earth, We Can Do This podcast is back. We've had over almost a 3-year hiatus. It feels like a million years. We did 6 or 7 podcasts a couple of years ago, and it went incredibly well, and they were all really interesting, in my opinion. They continue to get a lot of listeners or downloads, as they call them in the podcast universe. And so I am really excited about this podcast. Number one, it's my first one in almost 3 years. We're going to be really starting to do more of these going forward. So I don't know if I can commit to every single week because life has a tendency to get in the way. But I absolutely am going to try to do it as much as I can. And every week is the goal. I've got an incredible lineup of topics coming up. But today, it's all about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, it's a condition in children and adults. ADHD, you often hear it. People say, well, I have ADHD, or they make that comment, I have ADD. Many people may have little pieces of it, but it really is a condition, or is it a condition, or is it a disorder? Is it a learning disability, or is it a superpower? Oh my God. We're going to go into all of this. We're going to talk about what ADHD is. We're going to talk about the causes of it, the origins, what we think it is. There's some controversy there. We're going to talk about the symptoms in children and adults. And again, going over whether it's a condition, a disability, a problem, or is it a superpower, some combination thereof. And also, we're talking a little bit about the fact that it's a spectrum, quote unquote, disorder or a spectrum condition. I prefer to call it a condition, by the way. I'm probably going to default to that throughout the podcast. And then most importantly, I think at the end, we're going to talk about not only tips in dealing with it, but how you can actually somewhat, manage it a lot better. It's a lifelong thing if you actually have it. It doesn't go away. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And I think there's a lot of ways not to do it. And I have a personal experience because guess what? I have ADHD. I'm 53 years old, and only in the last 6 months did I actually come to terms with that. The funny thing is, I told a few people that know me pretty well, and their reaction was, yeah, like, no duh, like you didn't know you had ADD. I didn't know. I mean, and I'm going to get into my personal story a little bit later in the podcast, but, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and ADD or ADHD can have a relationship. And since I have trauma issues and have done therapy related to that, I just thought it was all related to trauma. What I came to realize, and fascinatingly so, and I think it really changed my perspective on my life and everything. I can't even explain how much better I feel. Now I kind of see the bigger picture, and I've done my homework, and I understand what's going on. So, all right, let's jump right in. But before we do that, I want to quickly plug my company, which is the reason why we're even doing this. Not the reason, the sponsor that enables us to do this, Contactsforless.ca is a contact lens seller that I built. I'm the owner, founder, director, CEO. My wife and I both own the company. Contactsforless.ca. And we are the only contact lens seller in Canada. By the way, we're on our way into the United States here starting later this year at contactsforless.com, and that'll be showing up probably around September 2021, October 2021, something like that. Look for it, US. But contactsforless.ca is the only contact lens seller in Canada or really in the world that I know of, gives 51% of our net profits to save the planet. And here's the cool part. You as the customer get to pick the nonprofit, the charity that you want to give it to. If you prefer Big Brothers, Big Sisters, if you Sierra, what else we have? Gosh almighty, there are so many different groups. There's 75 nonprofits on there. Doctors Without Borders, CARE. Oh my gosh, Sea Shepherd Society, one of my favorites. Just so many, protecting the environment, helping children, helping families, on and on and on. Even Alzheimer's Society is in there. I mean, there's a flavor for everyone, but you decide where our money goes, and that's very unique and very special. And we are the highest Google customer rated site that I know of in Canada, period, that does e-commerce, but certainly number one in our industry. No one touches us for eyewear or contact lenses online. Go to contactsforless.ca and try us one time, and you're going to realize why we are so awesome. We have an amazing team, great customer service, great prices, etc. Okay, enough of that plug. So let's get right into ADHD. So let me read what healthline.com says about ADHD. And I think this is, a general definition, but there's so much more to it than what you'll find online. When you go online, you see pieces of it throughout different websites. Start Googling and watching YouTube's, TED Talks, things like that. You'll see pieces. But this broadcast is designed to give you a really full picture of the whole thing as much as we can in the time that we've got. So Healthline says, attention deficit hyperactive disorder is a mental health disorder that can cause above normal levels of hyperactive and impulsive behaviors. People with ADHD may have trouble focusing their attention on a single task or sitting still for long periods of time. I can relate to this, but there's so much more to ADD or ADHD than this. And there is ADD and ADHD. They are different. The hyperactive part is really obvious in me. As you could tell how fast I talk, how fast I move, how fast I work. So I'm going to read. There's a guy named Gabor Mate. Dr. Gabor Mate. Here's his book, by the way, Scattered Minds. I would highly recommend if you are interested in this topic. This is a phenomenal book. It really actually changed my life in terms of how I saw the issue. But I'm going to read to you a quote from his book, page 4. And this is really short, but it's very interesting what he has to say about himself. Because here's a guy who is a surgeon here in Vancouver, Canada. He's a famous speaker on the ADHD and trauma and addiction issues. And he writes this: never at rest, the mind of the ADD adult flits about like some deranged bird that can light here or there for a while, but is perched nowhere long enough to make a home. The shock of self-recognition many adults experience on learning about ADD is both exhilarating and painful. It gives coherence for the first time to humiliations and failures, to plans unfulfilled and promises unkept, to gusts of manic enthusiasm that consume themselves in their own mad dance, leaving emotional debris in their wake, to the seemingly limitless disorganization of activities of brain, car, desk, room. ADD seemed to explain many of my behavior patterns, thought processes, childhood emotional reactions, my workaholism, and other addictive tendencies. The sudden eruptions of bad temper and complete irrationality, the conflicts in my marriage, and my Jekyll and Hyde ways of relating to my children. So, yeah, anybody who has ADD or ADHD already knows this, is listening to this. You can relate to that probably. I certainly can. And it's one of those things where, you start to see this and you go, my God, who am I? What am I doing? And you start to self-loathe. And there's really a tendency among people who are ADD, ADHD, to somewhat get mad at themselves, get frustrated. There's even a tendency to get quite frustrated at anything. There's a sensitivity there that comes with that. I can relate. I had it since I was a child. We're going to get into those things in a second, but I want to give you just a little audio piece. Jessica McCabe is this really fascinating TED Talk person who I came across, and I just want to share with you, just for a second, what she has to say and her take on it.
The thing is, while everyone experiences ADHD symptoms sometimes, an actual diagnosis is based on how many of those symptoms significantly and chronically impair multiple aspects of your life. Just like you can get sad and not have depression, you can get distracted and not have ADHD. And just like you can have mild depression or severe depression, ADHD can range from mild to severe. I also learned ADHD is a terrible name for ADHD. It creates a lot of confusion. We don't have a deficit of attention. What we have trouble with is regulating our attention. As ADHD coach Brett Thornhill puts it, it's like your brain keeps switching between 30 different channels and somebody else has the remote. Sometimes we have trouble focusing at all, and other times we get stuck on a channel and can't pull ourselves away, which in real life might look like we just don't want to do homework because we'd rather play video games, and sure, sometimes that's the case. But the truth is, there are plenty of times we want to be able to focus. We try, and we just can't. Current understanding is that this difficulty has to do with the way our brains produce and metabolize neurotransmitters like dopamine and norepinephrine. I learned ADHD is highly treatable. Stimulant medication boosts these neurotransmitters, which is why it helps us focus. It's very effective for around 80% of people with ADHD. And I learned that medication isn't enough. ADHD affects much more than our focus. It impairs executive functions like planning, prioritizing, and ability to sustain effort toward a goal. It affects our ability to regulate our emotions, our behavior, our sleep. It's not one program in our brain that it works differently. It's the whole operating system. It can affect every aspect of our lives. And there are a ton of strategies out there that can help. Cognitive behavioral therapy, coaching, even meditation or regular exercise can make a huge difference. Understanding your brain.
Okay, so yeah, that is interesting. So let me speak to that for a second. First of all, I like that. I like her overview. Jessica really does a good job of sort of talking about what it is and what it isn't. Her podcast, her TED Talk, which is on YouTube, Jessica McCabe, McCabe. You can Google that and take a look at that. It is a really interesting talk if you want to learn more about PTSD. There are a number of clips I'm going to have in this show, but that particular insight, I think, is a great overview and kind of touches on some of the things we're going to go into in just a few minutes. Let me briefly talk about my personal experience. So I was a extremely gifted kid. I was a hyperactive kid and a very sensitive kid. My mother left me when I was very young. My parents probably drank and smoked while I was in the womb, which that may have part of the reason why I have ADHD, who knows, had an abusive and neglectful childhood, et cetera, and so on. So I was kind of a very sensitive kid in a bad environment, okay? And we're going to get into Dr. Gabor Mate's comments on that in a second. In fact, where do I have that? That's coming up in a bit. He talks a little bit about parenting and how this relates. But in my particular case, I was a rough road. First grade, for example, I had to, my teacher gave me a note every single day that I had to produce for my grandmother. My mother had left, and my grandmother had to get this note every day. And actually, there's a box somewhere in this place here where all of those notes are stored. I've never looked at them. I'm 53. One of these days, I'll pull them out and read them. Basically, I really had a hard time functioning in school. But in second grade, I was tested and put into a program at that time called Quest program. It was for gifted children. And in that scenario, I thrived. But my father was too lazy, too neglectful, too stupid. I don't really know. And he didn't keep me in Quest. I was in a one-day program. I could have been in an everyday program, but he refused to put me in there. I don't know why. I mean, really, my father, boy, I could do a whole podcast on the failings of my father. But nonetheless, it really was an opportunity for me to see and get a glimpse of what truly intelligent and gifted and somewhat different kind of children were operating on a different level. And for me, it was an opportunity for a short period of time, a couple of years, where I was in that program where I began to see what was possible. But I also grew older and developed incredible addiction issues and dysfunctions, and had difficulty keeping friends. And I was kind of a mean and temperamental child, very sensitive, had anger issues, very young. Broke things periodically and would get really mad. And it was a challenge, I'm sure. Although my parents were completely ill-equipped to be good parents to start with, or my father, who really didn't parent, and my grandparents, who were older and alcoholics. So here's this dynamic where raised in a dysfunctional dynamic didn't help. As I got older, I got a little better, but I still kind of hid from myself in a lot of ways. And I was a difficult employee. I got fired a ton of times. I think I probably got fired like 6 or 7 times. People with ADD are much more likely to have addiction or issues or be fired or have broken relationships. Had a lot of friends that I either stepped on or walked away from, or I was distant from. Even later in my life, I have some old friends that I still haven't really connected to too much, trying to, but it's sort of hard for me. But I'm getting better as I get older. As I get wiser, I'm aware more, but it's still a major issue for me. I did EMDR therapy because I have a lot of trauma issues going back to my childhood. That includes death and abuse and neglect. And I'll tell you something, anybody, by the way, who has PTSD or trauma issues of any kind, anxiety, panic, strongly recommend EMDR. I can't remember exactly what it stands for. Eye movement desensitization something. But it is awesome. I've done EMDR. Find a good person who does EMDR, and it can really, 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 really help. But there is a connection between EMDR and ADHD. In fact, this clip that I'm going to play does not discuss this, but Dr. Gabor Mate, this guy again, Scattered Minds, I strongly recommend this book. He touches on the balance between and what is going on here. ADHD is a potential. There's a potential in children for it, genetically and other causes, which I'm going to bring up in just a second. But those causes are latent in a lot of kids. But in bad parenting scenarios, trauma, neglect, and other dynamics that are in the environment can make it much, much, much worse. A dysfunctional parent can really add to the possibility of having a child develop into ADHD. And ADHD is almost always, like literally always. I mean, we can there's no such thing as always in science, but let's say 99% are going to be present in children. People that discover that they're ADHD as adults, all they got to do is look back and they're going to see that they've always had it. Same with as with me. So I'm going to play this clip here briefly, and this is from Dr. Gabor Mate, and he just kind of summarizes a little bit about the parenting aspect of this. I think this is fascinating what he says.
These children have difficulty controlling their impulses. When their brain tells them to do something from the lower brain centers, there's nothing up here in the cortex, which is where the executive functions are, which is where the functions are that are supposed to tell us what to do and what not to do. Those circuits just don't work. So there's poor impulse control. They act out, they behave aggressively, they speak out of turn, they say the wrong thing. So poor impulse control. But again, please notice that the impulse control problem is general amongst kids these days. In other words, it's not just the kids diagnosed with ADD, but a lot of kids. The second criteria for ADD is physical hyperactivity. So the part of the brain, again, that's supposed to regulate physical activity and keep you still, just again doesn't work. And then finally, in the third criteria, is poor attention skills. Tuning out, not paying attention, mind being somewhere else, absent-mindedness, not being able to focus, beginning to work on something, 5 minutes later the mind goes somewhere else. So kind of a mental restlessness and the lack of being still, lack of being focused, lack of being present. These are the three major criteria of ADD. The developmental conditions for healthy childhood, psychological and brain development are less and less available, so that the issue of ADD is only a small part of the general issue that children are no longer having the support for the way they need to develop. And the essential condition for the physiological development of these brain circuits that regulate human behavior, that give us empathy, that give us a social sense, that give us a connection with other people, that give us a connection with ourselves, that allows us to mature. The essential condition for those circuits is the presence of emotionally available, consistently available, non-stressed, attuned parenting caregivers.
Wow. So anybody who has had really bad parenting and may or may not be dealing with ADHD or trauma issues and seems to try to wonder, why is it that I act this way? What's wrong? What's wrong with me? This is, what am I doing? Why am I having this issue? This may be sort of a light goes on in the mind of you, those who are listening, or if you're seeing your child, maybe you're a parent who questions your parenting skills. By the way, you shouldn't be spanking ever if you're spanking. That's absolutely disgusting and you shouldn't spank, period. Okay. And screaming in your child's face should never be happening. You're mad and you want to show intensity when something's really bad. Like my child ran through a parking lot the other day and almost got hit by a car. I let her know pretty quickly that was not cool in no uncertain terms. So there are times when it's important. But overall, are you questioning your parenting skill? Do you have a child who's struggling and you're like, why is my child acting this way? Okay. So think about it. Okay, think about what's going on, how you're acting, and what are you projecting? What are you being? So parenting is critical. So I'm talking not just to those who may be victims of all this, or victim might not be the right word, a person in a circumstance such as this. Victim too. I don't know. I like to stay away from the word victim just because we are all victims of circumstance, so it's all circumstantial. But there are victims in the world. Absolutely. There's rape, murder, and killing and abuse and neglect and all that stuff. And I had all those things. But if I use the word victim too much, I get caught up in that victim thinking. So I try to stay away from the word victim so much and that I went through a thing. And if you're a parent putting your child through a thing, really do the math. There are some estimates of 10 to 20% of all children have ADHD or some element of it. Excuse me. I've been drinking coffee. But if that's the case, then that means the 10 to 20% of you as parents, or 10 to 20% of you out there who may not even know it, possibly have some element of ADHD. And we're going to get into whether that's a superpower or a learning disorder, but certainly untreated, undealt with. And I don't mean treated by drugs. I mean treated psychologically, treated emotionally. If you're not doing it for your child, if you're not doing it for yourself, then you're only going to continue to struggle. Trust me, I know. I'm 53 years old. Went through a lot of really good relationships, some wonderful women in my life gone because I just couldn't operate in the way that I needed to. I've got a great wife and a daughter now, and I'm a parent. Oh my God, I'm so much better than I used to be. But I still have struggles, and I'm 53, and I'm pretty well educated on this stuff. Done a lot of I meditate, I work out, and blah, 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 but I still struggle. So that means if you put it all together, you're still going to have some, challenges, and I still have those. So anyway, parenting matters. Parenting matters. I want to talk briefly about Dr. Gabor Mate's some of the stuff he also talks about. We can't really get into. There's a whole nother topic about him. I would love to get him interviewed because he is so fascinating. I am a huge fan of this guy because of the way he sees not only the issue, but generally how he deals with addiction and trauma and struggle within the human condition. He is a fascinating guy. But he makes the connection between stress, mistreatment, childhood abuse, and the susceptibility and how that can even feed addiction. So if you fought addiction or you've dealt with addiction, I'm not saying you don't need to blame somebody else. I'm not. This is not the point of this. But look deeply into your own personal life experience and see if there are origins of your behavior or maybe your childhood that mirror some of this stuff. And that's why you might want to get high. I know I dealt with drug addiction and drug abuse. I wasn't a junkie or anything, but I always was drawn back to weed constantly. Weed was to self-medicate. I'm one of these guys, if I could not smoke weed for a year or two, and you get me high one time, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to get some weed. And it was stupid. I mean, like people would say, man, how can you be addicted to weed? That's not addictive. Well, okay. For somebody like me, it's a self-medicating concept. It was addictive in the sense that when I felt that relief that I got from weed, which by the way, it's no relief. I got a whole nother podcast coming up about marijuana. I've smoked marijuana since I was 15 years old. I'm telling you, I'm not a big fan. I mean, it's got some benefits, but it's got a whole lot of negatives, way more than the positives. Anyway, let me just table that. I'll get going on that in a second if I allow myself to. But Dr. Mate talks a lot about that, the desire to relieve the pain, the emotional pain. And he connects the idea of trauma, which is the environment triggering the latency, the genetic and other aspects to the ADHD that are latent, that are sitting there underneath the surface, and it brings out the ADHD. So you're not just going to get ADHD one day. I mean, some kids just have it, but because they just they're on the spectrum, they're really high up on it. Maybe I'm high up on it. I don't know. But my experience was so traumatic as a kid, so disruptive, so unstable, so unsupportive that of course it was going to come out of me. And I think if you're listening to this and you've had that kind of dynamic and you've struggled with jobs or relationships or addiction and even focus and, and you always want to self-medicate or you want to play video games all day to turn your brain off, whatever it is you're trying to do to deal with it, look deeper. Because when you get older and older, you're going to have to be accountable to yourself later. I'm 53 years old and you have to look back on my life. I got a lot of regrets, but I also know that part of it was I was dealing with something. I'm not writing off my bad behavior. I'm saying to myself, gee, I deserve a little compassion and love, and I got to learn to love myself. By the way, can I make just one tip right away? Right out of the gates here for those people listening. We're 24 minutes in, so I want to make sure that if you've gotten this far, one thing I think everybody should do is say, I love myself 20 to 30 times a day. I love myself. I love myself. I love myself. I know it sounds silly. Try it. Try it for a week. You'll feel a little bit better because I think a lot of people don't. And particularly people with ADHD and trauma, a lot of times there's a lot of self-hate going on. I know this personally. So I strongly recommend saying I love myself as often as you can. And by the way, if you got a partner or a child, tell them I love you at least a couple times a day to each of them. Giving love, taking love. Get in the habit of it. Okay, so let's talk about the causes and effects of ADHD. Now, we've already talked about the idea of latent ADHD sitting under the surface and being released by the environment to some degree, or a circumstance or a set of factors. Now, you may be saying as a parent, but I'm a good parent and my kid has ADHD. Am I a bad parent? Doesn't mean you're bad. I mean, bad. What does bad mean? It's kind of a generic term. But what I am saying is that possibly you've done things you don't even know about. Possibly you have abuse and neglect in your childhood, and you're not even aware that your behavior is neglectful or abusive or really just kind of triggering fears and instability. Divorce alone can create an instability in a child. Just the idea of a divorce and not having stability, where you say, well, what am I supposed to do? Stay with my parent, this person who I don't love, etc. Well, if you're a young person who hasn't married yet, can I give you one tip? Don't get married and live with somebody unless you've spent a lot of time making sure that's the right person. If you have a child, you better commit. That's my opinion. Doesn't mean you have to be there forever. You can separate, but separate intelligently, emotionally, intelligently. If you're going to separate in a marriage or whatever, look at your child. Make sure your child feels stability and love all the way through. You're not going to be able to make it perfect, but you certainly can make it worse if you're not paying attention. But it really is a genetic issue. Most people agree that it has a genetic origin. There may be some other external factors, but genetics is the key. That's what we believe. ADHD is one of the highest, most well-researched psychological disorders there is. There are some people, even good old Tom Cruise and Scientology. Oh my God, that's a podcast. Who deny that it even exists, psychiatry, etc. At least my understanding of Scientology is that they don't even acknowledge that it's real. Scientology is such a gong show. But anyway, separately, you're going to have people that deny it. Like you have anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, and you're going to have anti-something. There's always a group, often some fringe, telling you that the earth is flat or Democrats eat babies or whatever silly things stupid things you're going to hear. You'll hear people talk about ADHD as a non-thing as well. It's a thing. It's a thing. It's a thing. It's a thing. Don't even listen to that talk that it's not a thing. Okay, so get that out of your head. Now, approximately 33%, about a third of all adults who have ADHD end up having children with ADHD symptoms or behaviors. Why is that? I think there's two ways to look at it. It could be that you act those things out and they mimic it. That could happen. That could be what's going on. It could also be that it's genetically being triggered. The environment of your behavior is unstable and causing the child to develop those symptoms. Or it could be that they're high on the spectrum genetically anyway, and it's just going to emerge no matter how awesome you are as a parent. One thing to all parents I will say, you can always be better. So no matter what excuses you're making in your mind right now, well, I'm fine. Hey, this is not me. Hey, that's cool. That's cool. But there is no such thing as a perfect parent, which means that if you are not always improving, then you are not you need to be listening constantly to yourself and how you're operating. Whatever you think you're doing, take a look at it every single day. Just please do that. Please do that for your child's sake. Now, brain development, there is some brain development issues around ADHD. They've done brain scans on children with ADHD and those who are not. There is actually a developmental difference in the brain development. In fact, there's even some research to show that maturity levels come along slower for people with ADHD, children with ADD or ADHD. I believe I was very immature. I think I still am immature, and I'm 53. So, I think that is certainly a part of it. And I even read somewhere that the brain size or some parts of the brain are a little bit different in an ADHD brain. So clearly there's a genetic function. There is some talk about toxins. Now, I'm going to just give it a minute or two. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on toxins because this is a really debatable topic. Toxins are bad anyway, so come on. Let's just say that's bad anyway. It doesn't matter. But I'm going to mention some of the toxins that have been named as possible contributors to ADHD. PFCs, perfluorinated compounds like Scotchgard or Teflon or non-stick sprays in your frying pan. PFCs, they're called. These, some people argue that they may contribute to ADHD. PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers. These are in clothing. This is usually a fire retardant, some blankets and beds and sheets and lots of other types of fabrics, sofas. phthalates, which makes rubber more pliable or flexible. They're in toys and raincoats and other kinds of rubber and plastics that are soft and bendable, because plastics and rubbers aren't really supposed to be that pliable. So they use chemicals to make them that way. BPAs, bisphenol A, I think it's pronounced, or bisphenol A. It's mostly in containers. This is why sometimes you see plastic containers say BPA free. So try to go with BPA free. If you're shopping at Walmart, which is infamous for selling stuff that's not necessarily going to be the most environmentally focused, although they're making an effort. Really, that's, they're selling stuff from all over the world and made who knows what. So keep an eye on it when you're in these sort of, quote unquote, lower cost selling environments. Be careful what you're buying, because you want to look for BPA free. Sometimes you got to go online and find, look, BPA free, is it? Google it. I would strongly recommend that. Like Nalgene bottles are BPA free. I strongly recommend, if you're using bottles, use Nalgene. I think that's what it's called. There's also some research to show that exposure to lead is, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, mentions lead as a possible contributor to ADHD. What can we do about all these toxins? I mean, they're there. So we've got to toxins is a whole other topic because they're in everything. I mean, I've even wearing clothing that have polyester and other things in it. I don't even know, really, honestly. These are petroleum products, some of these things I'm wearing on my body. I mean, whatever. I think the stitching might even not be cotton. It's not going to be hemp. So, we really need to look carefully at what we're putting on our bodies and what we're putting into our bodies through the, cooking sprays and all that stuff. So, what can we do about that? Well, I don't really know what to tell you about that right now. That's not the topic of this, but I wanted to bring these up as possible contributors. A couple other contributors might be in utero smoking and drinking. Okay, I know my mother was drinking and smoking when I was in the uterus. And in fact, my family were all a bunch of chronic smokers, cigarette smokers, that is. Marijuana was bad, but smoking and drinking constantly was totally good, according to them. I almost wish they had smoked pot. Maybe they'd been a little bit nicer people. But anyway, smoking and drinking in utero and just exposure in general could be affecting children. There is a debate around exposure to media, cell phones, iPads, YouTube, video games, etc. This is a very controversial side of this discussion. I'm not certain I don't believe that it causes ADHD, but I think in ADHD children, that sort of frantic, frenetic intake of one-sided information, it's like YouTube, television going into your brain. You don't interact with it at all. It just comes at you. I'm not certain that helps people with ADHD. I think it's good for them to be stimulated. There's a stimulation issue for ADHD. This is about stimulation of the brain. We're going to get into a little bit more. That comes up a little later. But the stimulation part of it is critical. So is a video game a stimulation? Well, I just can't. I play a little bit of Xbox, a little bit with my daughter, but we limit the heck out of it, and we limit the heck out of YouTube because one-sided communication like that, in my opinion, is just not good for your brain, period. But I don't necessarily think I certainly don't think it's good for ADHD kids or adults. But that's probably why they're drawn to it, because it kind of feeds or placates that active brain, or, does this sort of internal stimulation. So it shuts off other parts so they can sort of, be constantly frantically moving without having to really process. So I'm not a big fan of all of those things. I think anything you do, video games and iPad and watching on your cell phone or whatever, really moderate it. If you're listening to this podcast, for example, I hope that you're not just staring into the screen. Hope that maybe you're doing something while you're listening to it, possibly doing some house cleaning or whatever the heck you're doing. But I do think it's good to not just stare at screens all day. I certainly don't think that's helpful. And there is some research that argues in favor of that position, that may be contributing on some level. Brain trauma, actual physical brain trauma, could be contributing to latent ADHD in the body. And trauma in general, this is a big one. Now, interestingly enough, the National Institute for Mental Health does not even mention trauma as a cause. I was like, what? Surprised. But there is a debate within the sort of the psychiatry and psychological community about whether or not trauma, emotional trauma. And by the way, let's talk about briefly, just for a second, what is trauma? I mean, trauma isn't just, I mean, I got spanked so much that I can't even touch a wooden spoon or see one. Like I actually have a physical reaction when I see wooden spoons, even in movies or whatever. You could argue that I need to get over that. Get over it. Yeah, maybe. But it's been lifelong and I've tried to get over it and I can't get over it. By the way, I apologize if you can hear some banging coming through the microphone. My daughter's running around upstairs and probably making too much noise. So if you hear that, my apologies. In any case, trauma is when you feel a sense of danger, a sense of lack of safety, and it can be very extreme, like everything from a rape or an assault can be a trauma, a car accident or a death, watching a death happen, a near-death experience. These can be all traumas, but they can also be sort of over extended period of time, emotional abuse, emotional neglect can have a traumatic effect on the body. Whatever it is that makes you feel unsafe and unsettled, and it begins to accumulate in the brain, into the emotions, and it begins to affect behavior. So when trauma comes up, and I have PTSD, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder due to my experiences. I always thought I was just trauma. It was all about my trauma, but it wasn't. It was actually ADHD and PTSD. And that dynamic really opened my eyes. It really opened my eyes. So if you're somebody who's dealing with trauma, anxiety, panics, take a little deeper look, possibly look and see if you may also have some ADHD or ADD symptoms there too. And if they are, then your sensitivity levels will be a bit higher. Your frustration level, your self-loathing, these other things might be contributing to how you deal with trauma and how you heal yourself or don't, as the case may be. Now, how do you know you have it? How would you know? You're listening to this. If you're listening to this and you go, well, I might have it. I mean, I have some of the symptoms, which we're about to list the symptoms in a second. There's a website called ADHDadulthood.com /ADHD-test. So that's ADHDadulthood.com /ADHD-test. There's a bunch of these online. I thought this was a good one. It's a short one, but it'll give you a little bit of an insight of whether you might have some symptoms. I think if you really want to know, go talk to a therapist, a counselor, a psychologist. I would put psychiatry at the very back of the line. I'm not saying psychiatrists aren't important and don't have an important job, but my experience with psychiatrists is they are drug first, emotion second. And I think drugs are absolutely not your first or even your second or even your third mode of treatment. We'll get into the treatments at the end, but talk to somebody, maybe talk to some friends. See, do you think I have ADHD? Do I have these symptoms? If you're not sure if these symptoms exist in you, go right ahead and take a note to chat with somebody who knows you really well and have them take the test on your behalf. Do I exhibit these? If you're not able to see it. If it's in your child and you're not sure, your child can't answer those questions, but you can observe some of these behaviors. And again, here we go. Here are the symptoms for children. And they're not all the same for everybody. Let's be really clear. ADHD is a very kind of individual experience. It can be, one thing for another person, a slightly different thing for another. And there are also deviations within those symptoms, which I'm going to get into, particularly around focus and attention. So first one is self-centered. Okay, in children, often children with ADHD can exhibit self-centeredness. Trouble waiting. Their impatience is really high. Interrupting. I want to interrupt. I can't help but interrupt. I'm an interrupter. I was always an interrupter, still am. Fidgeting. Oh boy, I'm a fidgeter. I'm a big fidgeter. The foot shaking, whatever. My daughter is picking up some of these symptoms and I didn't do it. So I think she has some of ADHD. She scratches the inside of her thumb. We've been working on it. And if she doesn't do that, she has to do her foot or so there's a little bit of a fidgeting thing with her. So clearly there's my daughter upstairs. You can hear her banging on the floor. I did ask everybody to be quiet, but they're not being quiet. We'll have a conversation afterwards about that. But fidgeting, temper tantrums. ADHD in adults and children have a very low tolerance for frustration. Tasks left unfinished. Yeah, unfinished work, unfinished things, doing things partially and not finishing them. This was a big thing for me. For example, and this is to really be honest, we're talking about children, but even from my childhood on, I literally can't remember finishing a book in my life. I've read a lot of books halfway or 3/4 through. Even the Hobbit series, I was really into the Hobbit thing. I never finished any one of the books. I would read and then skip, and I was always feeling like I needed to move faster through the book. Lack of focus. This is kind of obvious, but there's two kinds of this. There's the lack of focus, and then there's the hyper focus. So there's two kinds, and you'll see two from both. So like, for example, for me, I can really get into something and really, really, really focus on it, but I can't do like more than that. If I'm really focused, then anything else irritates me. Whereas on the other side, there are some people who just can't focus very hard. It's really hard to focus on something. So there's a duality there, and they both can be present in the same person at different times. Daydreaming, again, when I say daydreaming, I want to caution that, you may have one or two or three, your kid, it doesn't mean that they have two or three of these and suddenly they have ADHD. So let's be careful in terms of, grabbing a few of these and go, oh my God, that's my child, or that's me. You got to have a lot of these, and they have to be present since childhood, and they have to be disruptive to some degree. They have to be difficult to adjust to and affect your life. And really, that's the key, is it's got to be affecting your life in some way. Cannot play quietly. A lot of kids can't play quietly. So you want to look at this in conjunction with other possible symptoms. Careless mistakes. This is something my daughter exhibits. Reading. She'll skip words and sentences. She'll look at she's not dyslexic. She'll just flip numbers. Instead of 14 plus 2, it'll be 41 plus 2 or whatever, vice versa. Skipping words and sentences, just kind of her eye going over words too quickly. You could say, well, that's just, kids do that. Yeah, many kids do that. But in conjunction with the other factors, I am suspecting that my daughter may have at least low spectrum ADHD. In adults, it's not that different. Again, I'll say this again. Adults with ADHD are more likely to have divorce, more likely to be fired, more likely to have addiction issues, more likely to have dysfunctional relationships. It's just research. So in adults, again, lack of focus. Again, it can be hyperfocus or the inability to focus. Hyperfocus, again, I just brought it up. Hyperfocus is really narrowing on one thing and being so focused, you don't even hear things behind them or what's going on around them. Managing time. Oh my God, it's a big one. For me, that's a big one. I will try as hard as I can to be on time, and I'm late for literally almost everything. Same thing is disorganized. I leave the house and I forget things, have to go back. Did I lock the door? Where are my keys? Where's my glass? I lose my glasses at least 3 times a day. I have to run around. I have to ask my family, my wife, can you help me look for my glasses? Oh my God, it must drive her crazy. Impulsivity. Oh, that's a big one. It's true in children. I didn't bring it up, but it is children and adults. Impulsivity. I'm highly impulsive. I actually even write on my hand right here sometimes, pause in a Sharpie, just to remind myself that I need to pause when I'm about to react or something pisses me off, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. I have to slow down, pause, take a moment. Should I do that? Let's think about it. Sometimes I even ask my wife, should I do that? Because I need a second opinion. Impulsivity. I could go into stories that would, one story briefly. I ended up in a crack house. I was in law school. I was on my way to school, and a woman wanted to ride on the side of the road, said, hey, I'll give you $10 to give me a ride 10 blocks. And I was like, what? So I did it. Impulsivity. She goes, you want to come in? Who is this woman? I went in. Impulsivity. It ended up being a crack house, and I watched a bunch of people freebase or smoke crack in front of me, and I actually took a hit. I took a couple hits and got super, and then I tried to go back to school that day. Oh my Jesus Christ. Like, who does that? Well, I did that. So impulsivity. Forgets things easily. Yep, that's me. And it's probably you too. But if you're just forgetting things, it's one thing. But if you're having trouble managing time, you're disorganized, you can't focus, you're impulsive, and you're forgetting things, that might be a flag to pay attention to what's going on. Hypercritical of others and yourself, usually yourself too. I'm super critical of myself. I have to work on this every day. I'm terrible at it. I'm so critical of myself, and I'm also critical of others constantly. I'm judging the world. I'm changing my community. Like, for example, I have this park near my house, and people, it's not supposed to be a dog park. And yet people go in there, and there's geese and ducks, and they let their dogs chase the ducks around. And I'm like, I get so mad. But really, do I have to get that mad about it? I'm constantly judging others for their mistakes, for their issues, and I judge myself as roughly. Mood swings. Yeah, that's another one that can show up. I don't have mood swings as bad. This is not a big thing for me, but I think that, mood swings can be part of it. It comes to down to that sensitivity issue that comes up for people who have ADHD. Absence of motivation. Absence of motivation is just you're having trouble getting going, getting started. This is a tough thing for some people. Fatigue, hyperactivity leads to fatigue. So you can go, it feels like, it's like, you might even think you're bipolar, like that manic thing. You go up, you go down, but that could also just be hyperactive and then fatigue. Anxiety, panics, that kind of thing. It's also a symptom. I fought anxiety and panic, still do kind of much, much better. But anxiety and panics is a big issue there. And so I could go on and on and on. I'm already at 44 minutes, and I really want to try to keep this into an hour, or maybe a little bit more than an hour, probably. But I want to get into a few things. So I'm going to just read 2 quick quotes from this book that I think are fascinating. I'm going to read one quote, then I'm going to do a quick video of a guy named Theo who has a really cool perspective on his ADHD, and then I'm going to read you another quote on the back end. Okay, so the first quote, again from Scattered Minds, Dr. Gabor Mate. He says, "The distractibility fosters chaos. You decide to clean your room, which typically looks like a tornado has just passed through. You pick a book off the floor and move it to replace it on the shelf. As you do so, you notice that 2 volumes of poetry by William Carlos Williams are not stacked side by side. Forgetting the debris on the floor, you lift one of the volumes to place it beside the companion. Turning a page, you begin to read a poem. The poem has a classic reference in it, which prompts you to consult your guide to Greek mythology. Now you're lost because one reference leads to another. An hour later, your interest in classical mythology exhausted for the moment, you return to your intended task. You are hunting for the missing half of a pair of socks that has gone on furlough, perhaps permanently. When another item of clothing on the floor reminds you that you have laundry to wash before the evening. As you head downstairs, laundry hamper in arm, the telephone rings, you plan to create order in your room, and now that is doomed." Yeah, okay. So we're going to get to the next quote by Theo and listen to what he has to say about his ADHD.
Life in the public education system as a child with ADHD was very difficult. It was so difficult, my mother held me back in kindergarten to better acclimate me to my peers. In the long run, this served me very well. However, in the short run, it compounded my social inadequacies. Some students labeled me as stupid. One history professor in high school went so far as to tell me I'd only be average, but there's a place for people like me. As I got older, I quote-unquote outgrew my ADHD, whatever that means. Despite my academic success, some people still question my train of thought. Let me show you. I was watching a Red Sox game last week. David Ortiz hit a mammoth home run. Did you see Mark Wahlberg has a new movie coming out, Transformers? And by the way, if you have any time this Sunday, come see me speak at TED. You're all confused, aren't you? Baffled. Yes, this is my normal train of thought. And let me explain to you the logic about how this works. So we started with David Ortiz. David Ortiz plays for the Boston Red Sox. You know who else is from Boston? Marky Mark. So I connected Boston, Marky Mark. Now Marky Mark, I don't know if you remember, he played in the movie Ted. You know, the one with the creepy stuffed bear? Yeah. And so I correlated that to TED Talks. See, my brain works like hyperlinks.
Yeah, hyperlinks. That's kind of what Gabor Mate was saying in the book quote that I just read. And I'm going to read another one that goes further about attention. The distractibility in ADD is not consistent. Many parents and teachers are misled. To some activities, a child may be able to devote, if anything, compulsive, hyper-concentrated attention. But hyperfocusing that excludes awareness of the environment also denotes poor attention regulation. Also, hyperfocusing often involves what may be described as passive attention, as in watching television or playing video games. Passive attention permits the mind to cruise on automatic without requiring the brain to expend effortful energy. Active attention, the mind fully engaged and the brain performing work, is mustered only in special circumstances of high motivation. Active attention is a capacity the ADD brain lacks whenever organized work must be done or when attention needs to be directed towards something of low interest. A facility for focusing when one is interested in something does not rule out ADD, but to be able to focus, the person with ADD needs a much higher level of motivation than do other people. This is important, the motivation factor. Ignorance of this fact has led many doctors to miss the diagnosis. Quote, indeed, the characteristic of our patient, wrote a psychiatrist of a college lecturer I had diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, but whose GP or general practitioner wanted a second opinion, quote, is that he is able to focus his attention on something that he is really interested in, for which patients afflicted with ADD is very difficult, end quote. That is not what is very difficult. What can be immobilizingly difficult is to arouse the brain's motivational apparatus in the absence of personal interest. Okay, so let's get that straight, okay? So what we're dealing with here is that the ADD child or adult has to be really interested in it, or they're really going to struggle. Now, let's talk a little bit about whether or not ADD is a disability, a condition, or a superpower. In my case, I think it's sort of both. I have incredible talent at brainstorming. I think of things others do not. I'm the kind of person, if you came to me with an idea, I can expand on it dramatically. I have really out-of-the-box thinking. When I'm into something, I'm into it. My brain's 100% into it. And I can be I'm not trying to brag, but I can come across as brilliant. And then an hour later, idiotic, because I'm not interested. I'm highly creative and dynamic. I'm adaptable to my ability to shift in thinking rapidly. Give me various things I can move, A, B, C, I can do it. I observe everything around me. I'm extremely observing oriented. I notice things other people don't notice. But I struggle with tons of negatives, anxiety, panic, frustration, hypercritical. I'm very sensitive to frustration. My temper is, I really have to work on it. And so I want to just talk a little bit. Salif Mohammadi, he gave a TED Talk, and I think his little bit is quite interesting as well. He brings up this idea of hunter or gatherers. He makes a reference in the quote that he believes, and I think it's an interesting insight, that in the hunter-gathering era, being able to be being able to be aware of all this stuff and super sensitive to data and stimulus was important, because there were animals that could eat you or kill you, and you had to hunt for your food, etc. But in this modern time, people with ADHD, are we really adaptable to this strange society in which we watch TV and computers and have to type on keyboards all the time and have to focus on this minutia of detail all the time and organize it all the time? Is that really, that's modern society? Could be argued that in some degree, we are victims of modern society. Maybe we're genetically designed for a different era. I mean, that's one argument people make. So here's Salif giving his take.
The suicide rate is higher in people with ADHD and their families. My clinical colleagues have shared with me that many children they see with ADHD have already begun at young ages to self-loathe, even having thoughts and often actions of self-harm or suicide. The youngest example shared with me was 7 years old, daily thoughts of self-harm. The stress of not being able to function in an environment for which you're not adapted, while expected to, is heavy. People often think the comorbidities of ADHD, like self-loathing and depression, are purely inherent to the condition. But I'd argue they're in large part due to how outsiders react to us. So if you're the parent, guardian, teacher, sibling, friend of, or care about a child who is a potential hunting and gathering badass, or a literally unstoppable brainstormer, help them win their self-love rebellion. Check your frustration. If instead of punishing their shortcomings, nurture their abilities. If you find they're distracted, ask them, what were you just thinking about? Not because they're in trouble, but because it could be fascinating. And get them outside in nature. It can actually be as good as Ritalin.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. That last point, by the way, get them out of nature. It could be as good as Ritalin. Absolutely. Take your shoes off, walk in some grass once in a while. Get off the concrete. Move out of the city, by the way. Okay, that's a whole other thing. But really, get connected to nature. That will really help. But he's got a lot to say there. And I think Salif's talk is also a TEDx talk. Really interesting guy. And he had a lot to say. I don't have time to put everything he said into this podcast, but he was fascinating. ADHD, however, is a difficult thing to live with, and it requires people around you to be patient and to understand it. And so now we're going to get into how we treat this. this. What do we do now? Okay, so I know you've 54 minutes in and you're thinking, okay, when is he going to give me some solutions? Here we go. I'm going to spend some time on this, and I'm probably going to go over the hour, and I'm sorry about that, folks, but this is an important topic for those people who care about this. This is a big deal. For some of you, you might even be going, oh my God, like I've never gotten all this information in one spot before. I got to go find out now. Maybe I do have ADHD, or maybe my child does. What do I do? Okay. So drugs are the first place that a lot of people will say, go take drugs, take Ritalin, take Vyvanse or whatever. Look, I took Vyvanse a little bit and yeah, didn't like it. And it's got a lot of side effects. And let's just be really clear. I don't care what anybody says. It is not the solution to ADHD. It's a short, all of them pretty much are addictive, either psychologically or actually physically addictive. These are stimulants. So I am not urging people to go straight to the drugstore, or to the psychiatrist and get the drug. I would say, no, hold off. Try other methods first. If you're really struggling so bad, maybe do a short-term approach where you're going to do drugs for a while to sort of get the behavior in check, then phase out. You got to be smart. You can't just go at things like, blindly. Oh, I'm going to take drugs. I'll be all good. Oh, God, don't do that. This is not how ADHD works. The effects of drugs can be high blood pressure, sleep issues, appetite issues, headaches, even personality changes can occur. Serious personality changes. Okay? It's stimulating parts of the brain. The dopamine center. So please be aware that this is not the way to go. Okay. Don't go the cheap and easy route. People with ADHD and parents of ADHD, there is no cheap and easy route. Let me emphasize that and say that twice. There is no easy route. If you're ADHD or a child, there's no easy fix. Oh, okay, there we go. We're good. No. Please. Don't even think that is a possibility. A drug approach is only designed to get you from A to B, and then at B, you got to make a change. You've got to make lifestyle changes. You have to live a different way. You know how alcoholics don't go to bars a lot of times, or drug addicts don't hang out with their old drug addict friends, or people with shopping issues don't get a credit, like take my credit card from me or whatever. This is how you have to look at ADHD. You have to change the way you live. Okay, you have to change the way you live. That is the only true way to focus on getting better if you have this condition. So let's talk a little bit about that. Okay, let's get past drugs. My number one recommendation to anybody with any issues, trauma, anything, even none of those things. You're just a person listening to this and want to learn about ADHD, do meditation. I started out doing transcendental meditation, TM. I wasn't really into the sort of the weird cultish side of it. The whole Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and the guy, I'm not into gurus. Call me strange or call me smart, but that's not my path. But I was glad to learn meditation. At a very young age, I learned it, and it really helped me out throughout the years. And I think in some respects, meditation saved my life. I was suicidal. In a previous podcast, I talk at length about that. And I think meditation was one of the keys. I think it was through the meditative practice that actually kept me alive at one point. So meditation. I now do OM meditation, OM, and that's it. It's quite simple. There's no gurus, there's no place, nobody to give money to, nothing like that. So meditate. Meditate for 15 to 20 minutes. If you can only do 3 minutes a day, that's fine. Sit down in a quiet place, burn some incense if you've got it, maybe a nice darkened room. You don't need a lot of light or noise, and try to meditate. And if you're just stressed, sit in your car. Do OM. OM. Each breath. One time, each breath. Simple. If you have PTSD, please go get EMDR. If you have post-traumatic stress disorder or anything like that, please go get EMDR therapy. There's behavioral therapy as well, which I'm going to get into in a second, but EMDR is, in my opinion, was one of the most important and powerful things in my life in terms of me getting over the hump, in terms of my sensitivities towards trauma. I walked around thinking I was just a trauma victim, and I was, but I now have moved through that to another place. Yes, I had trauma. Yes, I did. Absolutely. I own that. But I'm responsible for me now. So whatever happened to me before was then, this is now. Go get some EMDR. You can release a lot of that trauma. It is phenomenal. Work out. Work out, go to the gym, work out at home, get some weights, do yoga. Yoga's awesome. Pilates is good. I'm not a huge Pilates fan, but it's good. But I'm a yoga fan, and I'm a big working out fan. Do HIIT training, do Tabata, get into a sport, get into a league, whatever. But don't just think, well, I go walking every month, or I 6 times a year I go do this thing. That's not working out. I had a friend of mine who used to say, well, I work hard at work, so I don't need to work out. Oh, that's such a bunch of BS. Those people who work hard jobs, even physical jobs, need to work out even more. I know some guys in construction, they work out as hard as anybody because they know how hard it is on the body to work out. To work in that way. It beats their body up. So you got to go and do it got to have a physical positive experience. Okay. Find a career path that fits your lifestyle. I luckily did. There's a woman at the end. We're going to show her again, Jessica. We're going to quote her at the end. She talks about this, but find a job that fits your style of what you do and what you're good at and what you're not. If you're doing a job that's driving you nuts and it's bad for you, your ADHD is pulling and pushing at you, then find another career. There are other ways to go. Now, I know in this COVID period, it's tough. I get it. But find a way. I went into business, and I was actually worked for Human Rights Watch for a short while. I was in radio with the U.S. government a long time ago, and I've moved around. That's typical ADHD. Moved around a lot, did a lot of different things, but I've now learned so many skills. And then I started this company, and now I'm full time in this, running companies and doing my podcast as a side thing, working out, meditating, trying to be a father. I think I'm a good father, much better than I thought I'd be, and a good husband, good friend, trying to be that. That's a tougher one. Make lists and systems. I live by lists and systems. I use Google Sheets. I create daily to-do tasks. I check them off. I go through the process every single night. I write up my to-do list for the next day. I have to keep track of things and systems. It keeps me on task, and I'm very, 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 very productive. For somebody with ADHD, I'm about as productive as you can get, and it's because of my systems. It's not because I'm so brilliant. It's because I've learned to create systems, and over years, I've changed those systems. Those to-do lists I make, if you look at stuff I was doing 6 years ago, it's different than what I'm doing now. It's been evolving all the time. So like any good human being, you should be evolving and improving everything that you're doing. But systems, make lists, create checklists, to-do lists. Tell your family and friends, tell your wife, tell your husband. Tell the people you work with even. I know it's weird to be like, I have ADHD if it's not obvious. And that's not an excuse, but I have it. And if you could just be aware of it, it kind of helps me know, and I can be comfortable with myself a little bit. And I'm sorry if I'm this way, if my temper is like this, or I'm sensitive this way, or sometimes I seem like I'm spaced out or I'm not focused. I'm sorry. It's a condition. I'm working on it, etc. Be patient with yourself. I brought this up earlier. Say to yourself, I love myself 20 times a day or more. Self-loathing is a big part of ADHD for a lot of adults. They start hating themselves for the way they are. And, that's not going to help. You've got to start loving yourself, meditate. After my meditation, I always say I love myself 20 to 30 times. And then I say how much I love my wife, my child, my people around me, and the world. I always try to remind myself every day. I write down pause and patience right here on my hand almost every single day. Not every day. It's not there today, but it's there a lot. And it's because I need to remind myself to pause, stop for a second. The impulsivity is a big issue. Slow down. It's hard though. Agitation is a big part of ADHD, and you just got to really try to bring it together. And it's a practice. It just takes a lot of time, and you just keep working. And for every day that you fail, which you will inevitably all the time, you just keep coming back. Let's say you're having trouble with drugs. What do? Do you keep doing drugs? No, you stop. Go, God, I got to stop. Somebody says, man, you keep doing drugs and quitting and stopping and starting. Well, then at least I keep stopping. Take pride in the fact that you keep stopping. Yes, you keep going back, but you keep stopping. If you ever stop stopping, you're in trouble. So please keep trying, even if you fail over and over and over again. Sleep. Get enough sleep. Oh, this is a big one. Still for me, I still struggle with this. I get between 4.5 and 5.5 hours sleep a night. That is not enough. And I'm getting closer to 6 hours. Sometimes I get over 6 hours, very rarely. You got to go to bed at night. Go to bed. Neroli oil is a thing you can put into the air through these humidifier, disseminators, whatever they're called. And neroli oil is a good one. Burn some incense, whatever it takes to bring your body down. Do a little focus meditation. Think about the things you want to see in your life. Close your eyes, look at a candle, and imagine what you want to see in your life. Or do Om at night to calm down. And create a system. I have created a whole system of all these things. So I have a list. I get up in the morning and meditate. I do this, I do this, I do that. I have a system, structure to my day. I create structure. ADHD kids and adults, even though they struggle against it and fight against structure constantly, you got to keep trying to bring it into your life. Structure matters. But I'll tell you something, and I'm going to read this part. Part of this is a written piece because this is my conclusion. ADHD is a superpower and a fucking annoyance and a challenge and a problem. But it is a part of me and will always be. So I embrace it. I love myself in spite of it. And I would not be here today if it weren't for my ADHD, in the sense that I am who I am because of my experiences. And part of that is struggling with ADHD. I am smart. I am dynamic. I'm odd. I'm weird. I'm talkative. I'm interrupting. I'm horrible at telling jokes. I'm a great storyteller, though. Got a lot of them. I'm a brainstormer. I'm creative. I'm an out-of-box thinker. I'm a dreamer, exactly because of my experiences. And if I'm not, it's the trauma and the ADHD and all that put together, that's who I am. So my brain, my ADHD brain, has been at the center of all of this. And I wouldn't have it any other way, because this is who I am. And I'm very proud. I love myself now. I don't know if I did that. I know I didn't do that before. I do now. And it took work and it took practice to love myself enough to say, I love myself. I couldn't have said that even 10 years ago, even 7 or 8 years ago. But do not envy those with ADHD. That whole sort of, I'm ADD is kind of a cool thing, or I'm OCD because it's cool. No, it's not cool. It's not cool. For people who have it, it's a struggle. It's really something I would wish this on no one. It took me till I was 53 years old to figure out that I even had it. And again, like I said in the beginning of the podcast, when I told people, they said, oh my God, you're just figuring it out. We already knew. Some people will probably say that to you. God, we already knew you had ADHD. And my road was rough. I had a rough road, but it was fascinating. And there's a great book in there. If I could ever get myself organized and focused enough to write the goddamn thing, and maybe I'll write it, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll start it and maybe I won't finish it. But I keep keeping on. I just keep moving forward, and I keep loving myself more and more every day and trying to find joy in this journey, because I do love my life, despite all the challenges that I deal with every day. For life is exactly that, a journey where struggle and respite, where joy and pain and the journey and being lost meet together. And in between those dynamics, we grow and we evolve and we seek to become human. So I want to leave you with this thought by Jessica McCabe, and then I'm going to say something at the back end, and we're going to have a final thought here.
I'm happier and more successful than I've ever been in my life. So what happened? How did I reach my potential? 3 things. 1, I learned about my brain, my ADHD brain, both on my own and by connecting with others who have it. If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it is stupid, unless it happens to chat with another fish and realizes fish aren't great at climbing trees, and that's okay. There's plenty of ocean. 2, in learning about my brain, I found and stumbled into a job that engages it. If you spend all your time trying to get a fish to be able to climb a tree, you'll never see how far it can swim. It turns out I can be me and still be successful. I just had to find my ocean. 3, I learned strategies for the challenges I still face. I have no fish analogy for this one, I'm sorry. I guess I learned how to swim. Once you know what your brain's challenges are, you can find solutions to them. Once you look past the stereotypes and assumptions about people with ADHD and dig deeper, you learn what ADHD actually is. It's not people who won't stop fidgeting or getting distracted. It's brains that are chronically under-aroused, trying to get the basic level of stimulation all brains need. It's not about procrastinating or not caring. It's having executive function deficits that make it hard to get started. And it's not people being lazy or not trying enough. It's kids and adults struggling to succeed with a brain that doesn't always want to cooperate in a society that wasn't built for them.
Wow. Now that is a society not built for them. Look, I'm going to finish this on this note. I couldn't have said it better myself. Jessica really nails it. I found my ocean. It took me a long time and I almost didn't make it here. You, if you have ADHD or your child has ADHD or somebody you know or somebody you love who does, you can help them find ADHD. You yourself can. If you need help, go find somebody to help you. Go find a therapist or a psychologist. Just talk to a friend who you trust. Do your research. That really helped me. Going online, watching videos, learning about it. I watched YouTube videos on this and I would break down and cry because it would just like the realizations were too heavy. So ask for help if you need it. Please ask for help. I get a little emotional just saying that because it was key for me. My wife was my best friend and my partner and helped me in every single way. I'll forever be grateful to her for being patient enough to stick with me. Let's start with that. But there is a place for us ADHD folks. ADHD folks are kind of like a tribe of people that probably should have lived in a different era. But we are here and we can be successful. In fact, we can be more than successful. We can do amazing things. I'm not trying to brag, but I've done some amazing things in my life. I've also screwed up a lot of things, but I've also done a lot of amazing things, and I'm very proud of those things. And I think that to some degree, the combination of my qualities, ADHD and others, helped craft this truth and this reality. So thank you very much for listening to this very first episode in a long time. Earth, We Can Do This. Next episode will be coming out next Monday, hopefully. I'm going to shoot for it. My ADHD might have something to say about that, but I'm going to try really hard to nail it and have it out for next Monday. Thank you very, very much for listening. I really hope that you've enjoyed this. If you have any concerns or questions or comments, etc., you should be able to write the email on the screen. We have a new email address that you can write to, and I will try to personally respond. Assuming that you're not calling me names. And again, you've been listening to Earth, We Can Do This because we can do this. Sponsored and brought to you by contactsforless.ca. Thank you very much for listening and have an awesome and amazing day, week, year, and life. Goodbye, everybody. See you next time.
Earth, We Can Do This has been brought to you by contactsforless.ca, the only online contact lens seller in Canada to give away half of its net profits to help save the planet. So thank you for listening and thank you for supporting contactsforless.ca.